All right. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to present this work, which is joint work with Keith Head, Thierry, and Chenying. So we're going to stick with the example of the car industry. Here it's going to be electric vehicles, and it's going to be about thinking about the impact of industrial policies for a sector that has two important characteristics, which is a characteristics for electric vehicles, but also for a lot of industries that are targeted by industrial policies. And so these two characteristics are going to be, one, that there are very high fixed costs, very high investment costs, and also this idea that when you do industrial policy, most locations aren't going to receive these plans. So there's going to be a very strong substitution pattern between location being a production location, one production location relative to another. And then the other thing is that that's going to introduce a very strong substitution force. And then the other one is there's going to be multi-stage production. And so there's going to be this key input. In the case of electric vehicles, it's going to be batteries that is going to drive down the cost of the downstream product. And that's going to introduce a competing force, which is going to be a complementary force, which is going to say that battery cell production is going to be a complement to assembly location and vice versa. And so I'll talk about in a second how solving these location choice problems and how supply chains reconfigurations subject to industrial policy are going to be very complex under this environment. But the counterpart to that is that because these industrial policies are going to cause these types of reconfigurations, that understanding how the supply chains are going to reconfigure is going to be critical for evaluating the impact of these industrial policies. If we want to think about what's happening to prices, what's happening to production levels, what's happening to expenditures on electric vehicles, we have to understand how these industrial policies are going to reshape these global production networks. And I'm going to show too that in this case, especially where the increasing returns take the form of these very high investment costs, that there's going to be this additional feature that when supply chains are going to be reconfigured, it's going to create what I'm going to call open-close decisions. Some facilities open, some other facilities close. And that's going to induce basically jumps in what I'm going to call delivered marginal cost. The new facility is going to have a different cost of production than the older one. It might be bigger capacity, lower marginal cost. It may also be located in a different part of the world, which is going to make the delivered marginal cost component different. And that's going to look very different from a model where these increasing returns are going to be smooth, where for every percentage increase you get in production, you get a certain decrease subject to a parameter in the marginal cost. So these open-close decisions that respond to industrial policy are going to create, not only are they going to create jumps, so they're going to be these discrete effects, which we want to quantify, but also even the direction of those jumps cannot be determined a priori or by a single parameter like it can when the increasing returns are going to be smooth. So kind of let me give you a simple example of that. I'm not sure if I can keep using my example of industrial policies in the U.S., given that most of them have been killed. But I could switch it to the effect on European policy and ask: does industrial policy in Europe for electric vehicles, which is still at the moment very much in the works, both existing and planned policies. How is it going to affect the delivered marginal cost of electric vehicles in the US? And there are cases where it can lower the delivered marginal cost in the US. New production facilities open up either in Europe. They may even have some incentives for some American facilities to open up with the increased volume of electric vehicles being consumed in Europe, and that could lower the delivered marginal cost of vehicles in the US. It could also have the opposite effect. So you could think about the opening of a big battery facility in Europe as also being associated with the closing of a battery facility in the US, which is then going to raise the cost of batteries available for cars that are being assembled in the US. Yeah?
Do the battery plants and the auto plants have to be co-located, or do they?
No, they don't. And in fact, I'll show you in the data that they aren't. There's pressure over time to bring them close together, but they're spread all around the world. And currently, for example, if you think about the assembly of electric vehicles, both in the US and in Europe, it's still pretty much dominated by batteries that are coming from Asia. And so the last part then is we really need, if we want to quantify, if we want to do a quantitative evaluation of industrial policies, we really need to understand kind of where these jumps occur and even kind of the direction of those, jumps. I'll close with our policy evaluations, both for industrial subsidies in the US and in Europe, and show you kind of what direction they go in and the size of those impacts. Yeah.
You can imagine, so suppose that you wanted to think about sort of this trade-off that you have in mind in a world without industrial policy. There's no industrial policy, and then you think about that there's heterogeneity in technology. Some technologies are ones where the fixed costs are high and the marginal costs are low. Some technologies are ones where the fixed costs are low and the marginal cost is high. But then you think that there's some equilibrium in which there's some indifference condition between the two, right?
So we have that set up in our baseline, and it's exactly the case that you have. I'm going to argue in a second, well, actually in this slide, that figuring out the equilibrium with those heterogeneous technologies because of those jumps is going to be very challenging. But that's exactly the setup that we have. So it's also true in a baseline, even without industrial policies. That's for sure. So if you want to ask kind of what is the equilibrium industry configuration in a sector like electric vehicles, where there are both these strong substitution complementarity forces, that's a very hard problem to solve. And actually, this is kind of the point I wanted to make here. We have strong substitution forces within a production stage, both for competing locations for either cell production or for assembly production, and very strong complementary forces across stages of production. So I don't want to get kind of too technical into the lingo of the literature on supply chains, but basically solving these types of models that have both of these forces is very complex. We have algorithms that work very well if we assume just one of those forces and not the other, and vice versa. When we have both of those forces together, there's a big complexity, which means we're back to this kind of combinatorial discrete choice problem, that if there are, say, two stages of production in our case, and L locations, right, we have just a massive number of potential configurations for the industry. So for us, for the typical car firm that we're going to solve for, the number of possible configurations of their network on average is going to be a number that has 25 zeros to, behind it. So, right? So that it's just a massive complexity here. And so part of what we do is we adapt some methods from the operations research literature that are going to allow us to solve that kind of optimization problem in a matter of seconds. And the way we do it, I won't go into too many details, but one is we find a formulation of the problem where even though the profit functions are very nonlinear, we transform it into a problem that is a linear objective as a function of the paths that the firm can choose for sourcing its vehicles. And so we transform the problem into one where the basic decision for us when we solve the problem, say for Tesla, is when Tesla sells a particular model, the Model 3 or the Model Y in Germany, say, where is the assembly going to come from, where the car is going to be assembled, and for assembly in that location, where the battery is going to source from. And so, for example, for the case of Tesla and delivery to Germany, I'll show you some data for that in a few minutes. We see that Tesla has changed that decision over time. The cars used to come from California. Then when the Shanghai assembly facility opened, they came from Shanghai. And then when the Berlin facility opened up, the models that were produced in the Berlin facilities were then sourced from the Berlin factory. So we're going to focus on those problems, basically solving for the path of the problem. Now, this is going to rely on data that has enough detail to be able to capture that. And in our case, we do have that amount of detail about where the cars are going to be assembled, which model cars are being assembled, what batteries go into those cars, and where those batteries are produced, along with kind of all of the associated volumes. And so we're going to rely on both kind of this new data and this new kind of computational approach to solve this very computationally complex problem. Now, of course, the problem I described for Tesla is still a very complex problem because Tesla still has to decide, well, which facilities, assembly and battery facilities, is it going to operate? And so the decision about sourcing the Tesla Model 3 in Germany is still going to be linked with its decision to offer the Model Y, which shares a platform in other parts of the world. And so what we have essentially is we're going to transform this into a linear programming that is going to have these integer constraints. That Tesla can open 50% of one facility and 50% of another. It's going to have to either open or close all the different sets of facilities. We're going to rely on some commercial software which basically handles this kind of optimization problem, solving for the global optimal. So this is not this characteristics, this is not the sub-branch that is about heuristics. Because of the linear structure of the problem, you can actually solve for the global optimum with these integer constraints, and that's the type of problem that we can solve, as I was saying, in a matter of seconds using this type of commercial software. So this approach also has a lot of other advantages. It's something that this type of problem has received a lot of attention in the operations research literature, hasn't been used very much in the economics literature. We adapted to kind of make the problem look more like the ones that we have in terms of economics. So we, instead of thinking just about cost minimization with a fixed flow of goods, we endogenize the flow of goods. So that involves going from cost minimization to profit maximization. We allow for the entry of models, so the firms decide which models to sell in which destinations, subject to market entry cost. And this part of it was already in the literature, so this type of modeling is very flexible in the sense that it can accommodate multiple stages of production with, again, really importantly, no restrictions on complementarity or substitution forces between the facilities. It can allow us to give us a very flexible specification for the fixed costs. So in our example, an assembly facility can be shared by any model of a firm that shares the same platform. We also have data on what platform the cars are assembled on, and we can do it at that level of disaggregation. And then for batteries, it's going to be about the shape of the battery and the battery chemistry that is going to allow a battery facility to share the fixed cost between different types of batteries within that group. I already mentioned that we extend this to endogenous market entry in multiple markets. And in what I'm going to present, we're assuming CS demand, but you can also use different types of demands because, again, it's not the linearity of the demand or the profit function that matters. It's just when you turn on a path, you're going to get a certain level of variable profit for whatever kind of demand system that you want to use. Yeah?
What's this commercial solver?
Its name is called Gurobi. You may have heard of it. Actually, a lot of my econometrician colleagues also use it. I forget now the name of the leading open source one. It's almost an order of magnitude faster than that one. And fortunately, they're still giving free licenses for academic use. I'm happy also to talk much more about the software later.
Defining a technology as the ratio of the fixed cost to the marginal cost, and then make that a continuum.
No, you
doesn't work?
really can't. I mean, I'm going to show you the problem here that like a typical firm is going to solve, and that kind of will give you the flavor. But you really can't. They're just with the different stages and kind of this heterogeneous, as you were alluding to, kind of you have a certain fixed cost and a certain level of variable cost. You really can't transform it that way. So here's a typical problem that the firm is solving. It's going to think about what products is going to sell to what consumer. So the products here are colors. It's going to sell the blue and the pink model in the West, and the blue and the orange one in the central, and no models are going to be sold in the East. And for every model that's being sold, so if I want to sell the orange model to consumers in the central destination, I have to pick this path that I was going to talk about. I'm going to have to choose that I'm going to do assembly here, and I'm going to get my sales from here. Okay? And of course, the complexity here is not just once you know which facilities are open, it's a relatively trivial problem of finding the paths. The key issue is that which facilities you open and close are going to be interdependent. So you can only choose a path through an open facility, or another way of thinking about it is if you want to use a path, you have to open all the facilities that are along that path. And so we have the entry cost for introducing models, and of course, whenever you open a facility, that's going to be associated with a fixed cost. And so very quickly, kind of just the way we kind of solve and do this estimation is we estimate the marginal cost associated with these paths up to parameters. And given these parameters, we can specify the cost of a path. And then the variable profit, say, associated with selling the orange model in central, is then going to be a function, and this function can be nonlinear, of the delivered marginal cost, which is going to be a function of parameters that we estimate, and an endogenous level of market demand that we're also going to estimate in our final estimation. Now, this strategy is going to imply some restrictions. So we're going to assume constant marginal cost. The marginal cost can be very different across the facilities, but at a given facility, it's going to be constant marginal cost. If it wasn't that way, then firms would do basically what is called multi-sourcing. They would source a given vehicle a bit from one. They would equalize the marginal cost of production, which vary across the two locations. And I'll show you, or mostly just tell you, I think I have one graph on that, mostly just tell you that that just doesn't happen for electric vehicles. It's really single sourcing. And so single sourcing is a consequence of the constant marginal costs that, of course, those inputs are substitutes, right? We don't see Tesla sourcing, one car with kind of two batteries and another one with, two other different parts. It's like what battery is going into every car. And again, this idea that you're only using a single supplier is that those plants are incapacitated. And again, in our data, that's what that is very much what we see, that it's going to be single sourcing. And so I'll show you a graph, again, for Tesla supplying different models to Germany. We see very clearly that it's changing its single supplier, but it's always kind of using a single supplier approach, with the only time where it doesn't are transition years where one plant is coming online, and that multi-sourcing disappears very quickly. It's very transitory once the new location is chosen. And then the other restriction is that this is optimization at the supply chain level. And so in many circumstances, not all manufacturers, the firm that assembles and sells the car is not the firm that produces a battery. And so we have to assume joint optimization by this joint venture of the battery producer and the assembler, meaning a single decision maker. Again, here we're helped by the characteristic of the electric electric industry, vehicle industry, which is that this is kind of what happens. So what would break kind of the use of our algorithm is if a battery producer would produce a battery and kind of put it on a table and say, hey, different car manufacturers come and use my battery, and it'd be used by different ones. And we just don't see that. The battery producers produce for different clients, different car manufacturers. But in a particular location, the battery they produce is entirely dedicated to one client. And again, that's something we see very clearly in our data. This slide, just to say, there are huge investment costs. They tend to be an order of magnitude higher for cell production than they are for assembly. So in the billions for cells, sometimes kind of just 2 digits. We're not modeling the dynamics of that. So think about if there's a lot of learning by doing, think of it as I pay a high upfront fixed cost, and think about like that end level lower cost as being the marginal cost that that is going to be obtained.
So you capture it on the extensive margin between technologies, maybe.
So we do no, but so think about the learning curve. The cost starts high and ends up low. Like in our model, the way it's going to show up is it's going to be a low marginal cost. Kind of we're thinking this as a longer run effect. And I'm going to have to pay as kind of part of my fixed cost. I'm going to have to move down my learning curve. And that's kind of how we capture it. So it's really about that long run marginal cost of, say, a bigger facility once it gets to a certain scale level. Okay, so our data, we have, can I, yeah, okay, sure.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering if it would be useful to think about the scarcity of rare earths, as that's like a key input for the batteries.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll talk about that at the end. I'll show you a few counterfactuals just based on like the kind of what the IRA looked like and kind of what the European policies are going to look like. But the advantage of being able to kind of model the decision-making and supply chain reconfigurations is we can model in our counterfactuals lots of different types of scenarios. And so we've thought about potentially kind of including that. We already have a very long list that we do in the paper. We look at tariffs, different kind of combinations of tariffs and location requirements. But we could certainly add those too. And I think that is also kind of a big kind of concern for this industry. I agree. Or yeah, I'd love to. Let me see how fast I can go, and then because I'd love to talk a lot more about this. So let me see how fast I can get to my main results, and then we can talk some more. So here's our data. We're going to use actually. Well, when we started this project, the latest data we had is 2022. Now we have 2024 data. So everything I'm going to show you is based on 2024 data. You just see that even though these fixed costs are huge, you do see this is an industry that's been expanding. Up to now. And we see increases in assembly facilities being open. We're going to separate our analysis at the continent level between the Americas, Europe, and Asia. Fewer battery facilities. Again, they're bigger. The fixed costs are much higher, but we see a bunch of new battery facilities opening up, in particular the giga battery production in Berlin. Also the battery production in Nevada. A lot of these new facilities. Just a little bit of data. This is what I was saying before, that this is showing you the impact of distance, that assemblers still source the batteries from quite far away, lots of heterogeneity. Over time, there's still a big pressure to kind of source your batteries from closer. And so the mean distance that a battery travels to the assembly facility has decreased substantially over time. This is the example I was giving you for Tesla. Since I have 5 minutes, I'll just say it's really just kind of single sourcing when before it always using Fremont, so it sells all its models from Fremont. Shanghai opens, it switches to sourcing from Shanghai for the cars sold to Germany. Berlin opens and it's producing the Model Y, so the Model Y now is being sourced from Berlin. The only time we see that it isn't single sourcing is in the transition year, and then after that, one of them goes to zero. Here's kind of the configuration of the industry. I'm also showing you the headquarters here because we're going to estimate that these fixed costs of opening facilities do really respond to the distance of the facility to the headquarters. So that's something we're going to incorporate in our estimation. So we have the data we're matching to is going to be all of the locations and all of the car flows we see across the world. I don't have too much time to talk about that other than maybe kind of point out that what we observe in the data is a strong revealed preference, for example, for batteries that are produced in Asia relative to the US and Europe. So let me finish in the 5 minutes I have left and talk about the impact of industrial policy. So the first part I should back up is just modeling the baseline configuration and just matching, not just to this, but matching to a whole bunch of moments about where the existing production facilities are and who sources, how many cars are produced, what the flows are, and where the batteries and the assembly occurs for all the cars that are sold in the main electric vehicle markets around the world. So once we have that, we have all the parameters of how these firms optimize, and then we can model, okay, now given an industrial policy, or it could be something about rare earths, how are the supply chains going to be reconfigured? And so I'm going to show you this in just one example, kind of 3 examples, but we have others in the paper that were loosely inspired by the IRA and kind of what happened, also what's happening in Europe, of 3 types of subsidies to electric vehicles. One of them is a clean subsidy. You can think about that as the demand subsidy. Here we're going to model it as a 20% subsidy. It doesn't matter kind of what number we use. The key critical part then, when you see in blue and in green, is that we're going to also model what happens when you impose restrictions on that subsidy. So you subsidize, but you make it contingent on the vehicle being assembled in your country or region. And even more restrictive, you make it contingent on both the vehicle be assembled there and the whole supply chain being located in your region. In this case, the batteries also coming from your country or from your region. And so very briefly, we can kind of model exactly, well, what kind of expenditure responses we're going to see. We see this kind of classic protection versus kind of consumer surplus trade-off between the clean subsidy and the one that's contingent on assembly in the US. Here I'm showing it for the US, where you get the biggest boost in terms of demand for the clean subsidy. From a protectionist point of view, or if you care, put more weight on employment, you're going to see that, of course, requiring assembly in the US is going to boost the number of facilities in the Americas relative to the clean subsidy. And so we give a way of kind of evaluating what is a trade-off in terms of number of production locations and in terms of expenditures, lower prices, higher volumes of EVs being consumed. Then when we look at the even more constrictive one, and we can, by the way, we can also see the increase in assembly in the Americas. Where does it come at the expense of? And mostly Asia, a little bit of Europe. Then when we look at the most restrictive one, contingent on the sales being produced in the Americas, well, producing sales in the US is just not very cost effective. And so we see a huge drop in EV expenditures because of lower take-up. A lot of car manufacturers decide it's not worth for me to get this subsidy if I have to move that. And the ones that do so at higher cost. I'll show you the breakdown in a second. And it also makes the point that from a protectionist point of view, this is not a very attractive proposition. Yes, you do increase battery cell production in the US at this very high cost. It also makes assembly much less attractive because these cars are much more expensive. And so there's not much gain here, even from a purely protectionist point of view, and a huge loss in terms of, in terms of lower take-up. So I have the European one. I clearly don't have time to show you. These are kind of the numbers. So let me just take 30 seconds, and then I'll wrap up. You can see for each one, like in the unconditional subsidy, all cars get the 20% subsidy. You can see how take-up drops as you increase restrictions, which we see as basically lower subsidization rates. And then critically, we see what happens to cost. So kind of what do we get with this model of fixed cost? We can model the extent to which an increased subsidy, this clean subsidy, is going to lower the delivered marginal cost of electric vehicles in the Americas. And so our preferred estimate here is going to be a 4.5% decrease. This is not something that you can really estimate in a model without these fixed costs, where there wouldn't be kind of any response here. And then we can estimate the response of what happens to the cost of a car with the contingent subsidies. The cost would still go down with the subsidy contingent just on assembly. But as I was kind of alluding to just before, when you make it even more restrictive and you restrict it on the sales coming from the US, we see that actually the cost goes in the opposite direction. So we see what I was highlighting before, that even the direction of the change cannot be determined just by the parameters in the model. It's really kind of, you need a model that's going to really figure out how these firms are going to reoptimize when faced with different types of industrial policies. And so I'm out of time, and I'll maybe just focus on just this last point. I hope that I've convinced you that it's important to kind of develop models and tools that can handle this really kind of very complex problem of supply chain reconfigurations, because that's just a key aspect of understanding the impact of industrial policies. And I'll stop there.